the overall idea that if you just let people talk, it will be this pit of racist pandemonium is, as I said, I think it's sort of childish and it oversimplifies, but it is a great justification for having a lot of power over speech.
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and today we're talking with Greg Lukianoff of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and the author of a great new book called Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate. Greg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Very quickly, tell us what FIRE does.
Well, FIRE has been around since 1999. We were founded by Alan Charles Kors of Penn and Harvey Silverglate, who's a civil liberties attorney, in order to defend free speech, due process, and basic rights on campus. We've taken the lead in fighting speech codes and drawing attention to them and won hundreds and hundreds of cases over the years.
And the book Unlearning Liberty is obviously very much about it. It's really set on college campuses across the country, and you talk about it in the subtitle as the end of debate. One of the themes in the book, which is very interesting, is that you talk about how people think that we had a fight over free speech and political correctness, and free speech won. The news you're delivering is that couldn't be further from the truth.
It's completely wrong. There was this political correctness craze in the 80s and early 90s, and then all these speech codes rose up.
And the rise of the speech codes were, I mean, essentially what speech codes were saying is that certain types of expression, certain types of thinking are wrong and must be eliminated from the college environment. Talk about what are the types of speech that are typically, considered beneath, allowing, even in a university setting where everything is supposed to be open for debate.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is what it started out with in the 80s, with the justification for speech codes were typically racist or sexist speech. But it has gone so far afield, but in a way that any First Amendment lawyer could have predicted. When you make rules vague and broad, the administration starts using them just to police speech that's critical of them, that they don't like, to go after students they dislike. And this was completely foreseeable at the start of the speech codes movement. So nobody should really be surprised we've reached a point that just being critical of the administration is suddenly violating a speech code.
Well, in the book you talk about kind of the great watershed moment, or I guess I should say water buffalo moment, for the creation of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, happened at the University of Penn, and it's known as the water buffalo incident. Briefly recap that and then kind of explain how that set the tone for what we're seeing on campus.
Sure. In the late 80s, universities started adopting speech codes, and one of the great opponents of campus speech codes is Alan Charles Kors. And he was at Penn when in 1993 a student was woken up by a African-American sorority outside that was serenading the dorms. In fact, the entire dormitory was woken up.
And serenading, I mean, they were in a pledge week or something like that, where they're chanting and screaming very loudly.
Exactly, just generally being obnoxious. And he yells out the window, "Go home, you water buffaloes." And they bring him up on charges of racial harassment, with the whole world mystified as to how on earth is water buffalo a racial epithet. He was trying to insult them, but he wasn't. There's nothing racial about it. And this became a sort of an international symbol of how off course universities have gotten with regards to free speech.
One of the things you talk about a lot in the book is that universities, they just trample on due process, or many of them don't even really have what would be considered due process, where they investigate claims, fairly and figure out what was going on. Most of them, they're kind of verdict first, trial later, right? But what's a more typical case at a public university that you deal with?
It's such an incredibly mixed bag. I mean, definitely we've seen an uptick in free speech zone cases in the past couple of years, which is funny, like Texas Tech University that I talk about, where they limited free speech to one 20-foot wide gazebo.
So this is on a campus that's hundreds of acres, and they
28,000
say,
students.
You can say anything you want, you can think anything you want, but you have to be in a gazebo that's the size of a small hotel room.
Yeah, exactly, 20 feet wide. And so I don't think any normal person would say that's constitutional. It's obviously not. You can't even fit 28,000 students into a 20-foot wide gazebo. But this came up again this summer. University of Cincinnati, a libertarian student group, they were trying to circulate a petition, a right-to-work ballot petition, and they were told that they needed to give 10 days advance notice if they wanted to petition the government for redress of grievances, and that they would have to limit it to 0.1% of campus, their tiny little free speech zone. They didn't enforce this across the board for other students, and they even told the students that if they were seen, quote-unquote, walking around campus, they would be, the police would be called on them.
Now, private universities, it's slightly different, right? Because they make an either implicit or explicit contract and say, you can come here It's a private organization, so you have to follow our rules.
Right.
So people can say, oh, you know what, we give up some of our First Amendment rights.
Right.
So how does FIRE, in the book, the cases that you talk about, how do you deal with private universities?
Our stance on private universities is one of the reasons why I was attracted to FIRE, because they actually have the most coherent answer to how you deal with private universities. And it's simply holding them to the way they present themselves and the promises they make in their materials.
Right.
So Yale and Harvard, they get billions of dollars in donations. They get the best and brightest of both faculty and students. And they present themselves in their materials and to the world as a citadel of freedom of speech and free expression. So they are absolutely...
And free thinking.
And free thinking.
This is where you go to have your mind blown, right?
Yeah,
and to learn the frontiers or the next great developments in human cognition.
Exactly. Yale has beautiful language in its policies, talking about mentioning the unmentionable, thinking the unthinkable. This really bold conception of freedom of speech.
That stems from a mid-'70s statement by C. Van Woodward,
Yes.
then a prominent Yale historian. And it was really kind of that statement set the tone for a lot of American academia coming out of the 60s, of saying, you know what, these are places where, the whole point is to remove yourself from the hurly-burly and hustle and bustle of everyday life, whether it's commerce or religious or whatever, and you come to a place where you can really sit down and think.
Exactly.
Talk a little bit about how nothing could be further from the truth.
Well, I had a whole chapter in the book, and I have on Yale and Harvard, partially because I run into this argument sometimes, like, who cares about these other little state schools? And I'm like, no, this is also happening at Yale and Harvard, two of the most famous schools in the world, really. Yale had actually been pretty good for almost my entire time at FIRE until something happened. It might have just been they added the wrong administrator or something, but as of 2008, they've been lousy. And in 2008, you have two different cases. One in which the university intervened and told the student government that they couldn't have a Fitzgerald quote on
F. Scott Fitzgerald.
F. Scott Fitzgerald. In my opinion, all Harvard men are sissies, and they wrote, we agree.
And this was a T-shirt that Yale traditionally puts together. They come up with a T-shirt to make fun of Harvard before the Harvard-Yale football game.
And Harvard does the same thing to Yale,
Right.
and usually they're really vulgar. Right. And in this case, they went with something that was pretty tame.
Right.
And the administration came out strongly saying that this is unacceptable.
And in this, it was the idea that sissies was making fun of gays or lesbians.
Yeah, which points to a lot of the problems in the way we talk to each other, the sort of like failing of discourse. Because one, in context, that was not the way Fitzgerald meant it, because the full line is, all Harvard men are sissies like I used to be.
Right.
He's not saying he was formerly gay. That was not the way the students intended it, and that was not the way it's usually used, at least among people under 40 today. It's more or less of an anachronistic joke.
Right.
And at the same time this was going on, the university had actually intervened to prevent a book called The Cartoons That Shook the World that was specifically about the Mohammed cartoons, to ban them from showing any image of Mohammed, even ones that had never been controversial in the past. So if something happened in 2008, Yale turned a corner, and it's been pretty reliably bad since.
And the Cartoons That Shook the World book is fascinating because the scholar who wrote that and published it with Yale University Press, which is a highly regarded press,
of course,
insisted in contractual work that the images would be reproduced. And then the university stepped in after the publishing house had cleared the manuscript.
Yep.
So we're left, with Yale, a citadel of higher learning and a boundless knowledge, and mentioning the unmentionable, trying to publish or squelch publication of a book where you can't talk about the things the book is about.
Exactly. Well, one of the reasons why I wrote the book was because I talk about all these insane cases of students getting in trouble for, in many cases, incredibly tame speech. But I've increasingly, over the years, gotten this sort of like, but so big deal. Universities are a little bit heavy-handed.
Right. I mean, this is just the equivalent of having smoking bans on campus or drinking bans or something.
People have become way too comfortable and way too used to this. And I make the larger argument that it harms our society in two distinct ways. One of them is the reason for the title, Unlearning Liberty. I was on an NPR show just this week, and hearing about students saying, oh no, speech isn't that bad. Sure, we have to get 10 days advance notice in order to protest. Sure, we have to do it in this tiny little zone, but they're pretty fair, even-handed about how they do that. And I'm like, no, that's unconstitutional. You're learning to accept the government telling you where you can protest, how you can protest, in a way that a previous generation would have utterly and rightfully rejected. So it's a long-term threat to our overall freedom if people don't get that they have rights in the first place. Higher education is supposed to be a place where you seek out people that you disagree with for engagement and discussion. That can't actually be cultivated as the great intellectual habit that it actually is if you get in trouble for having the wrong opinion. So what I think is actually happening on campus is not so much that people are changing their minds due to censorship, they're just not talking about what they believe, or they're talking to people they already agree with.
So this helps explain why, despite the kind of overarching, most people certainly on the right, and I think a lot of people in the center would say, over the past 30 years, the left has really taken over the academy, and yet the country has kind of veered towards the center, if not the right. So, I mean, what you're saying is that these attempts at mind control are not working. You get people to shut up, but you don't actually get them to think differently.
Right, and worse still, you're actually encouraging people to put themselves in echo chambers, to talk to the people they already agree with. So in that sense, kind of like that's one of the things that's wrong with our society, is we don't have, the smart people who disagree talking to each other, they hate each other.
Did universities have speech codes before, say, 1985 or 1990?
I've never claimed that there was a golden age for free speech on college campuses. And that definitely, I joke that there might have been a perfect week in 1977 when everything was great, when the old authoritarians were over and before political correctness began. But the current kind of speech codes are the ones that come more out of the 80s. There certainly were different kinds of restrictions on speech before that, but they'd largely gone out of fashion by the 1970s, but then came back into fashion with a whole new justification. But they still end up doing, in a lot of ways, the same things. I think that there's a huge temptation by people in power to want to be in charge of everything. That particularly with the huge expansion of bureaucracies on campus, there's a lot more people who put themselves in maternalistic or paternalistic positions over students.
And talk about that, because this is also fascinating for all the discussion that people say about, higher education isn't being funded well and we're losing tenure track lines and research faculty. In fact, the great increase in staff or in faculty are in administrators.
Absolutely, and this is something that administrators, of course, push back against, but it's government reports that are saying this. Somewhere between 2004 and 2006, the number of people involved in administration and staff at universities passed the number of people at universities involved in instruction. And that's just keeps on growing. And what FIRE ends up fighting all the time, it's not usually a faculty. We actually defend faculty. It's these mid-level administrators who don't know proper boundaries, don't have any appreciation for freedom of speech. I think some of the younger people were sort of scratching their heads about why this civility pledge that Harvard students were asked to do last year was such a big deal. It pressured them to sign something that pledged themselves to count civility, kindness, inclusiveness on par with intellectual attainment. And the interesting thing is kind of like, students of the 60s would have said, you can't make me be nice.
They would have literally given the finger.
Yeah, they would have rioted.
And this is also part of the kind of interesting backdrop of your work in the book, is the idea that if we don't have these speech codes, if we don't have civility pledges, if we don't have honor codes, then it's just going to be pandemonium, because everybody going to school is actually a racist, homophobe, poor-mannered, horrible human being. Talk a little bit about that. Where does that come from, and why is that wrong?
When I was at Stanford in the late 90s, it was just sort of assumed that underneath everybody there was this horrible sort of racist bigot. It's really a childish oversimplification in my mind. So you have these really aggressive programs like the University of Delaware program that's trying to change people from stop being so horribly racist. Meanwhile, you look at the surveys of the students when they were coming into Delaware, incredibly tolerant, incredibly open-minded, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum. The overall idea that if you just let people talk, it will be this pit of racist pandemonium is, as I said, I think it's sort of childish and it oversimplifies, but it is a great justification for having a lot of power over speech. And I think that it becomes so tactically convenient for people to believe this, that they continue to sort of perpetuate this idea that we're dealing with a generation that's much less enlightened than it actually is.
It's an odd thing. So the university, which is where free speech is supposed to take place, critical inquiry, and you're supposed to, really start working your brain like a muscle. That's being, you're being told, don't use your brain, just mouth what we tell you. From the residence hall, residence life, or from faculty who are politically motivated. Out in the world, though, we see this flowering of a kind of antinomian, anti-authoritarian, highly critical of all claims to knowledge culture, whether it's South Park or online or whatever. What you're talking about in Unlearning Liberty is that the university, even as it becomes more central to people's life plans, is actually becoming less important to what you're going to end up doing.
Yeah, and I think I talk about cultivating cheap dodges to debate, and among those I talk about selective uptightness and selective relativism, or feigned outrage for that matter. That people can go and watch, South Park can be their favorite show, they'll watch Comedy Central all day long, but the rules are at the university, the bar for offensiveness is set incredibly low. So there's a huge disconnect between the way people actually live their lives and the way they're taught to actually talk about things in universities. And a lot of these tactics end up really short-circuiting meaningful debate and discussion in the places where they most need to be happening.
FIRE has a kind of speech code of the month and everything, and, and you can see all of that on the fire.org.
Yep.
But where are the schools that are getting it right?
Well, University of Virginia has been very good about working with FIRE, and the reports, at least, that we get is that they actually do a good job of trying to get people across lines of difference, talking to each other. But overall, I think that there is a shying away at most universities from what could really fix the problem, which is this cultivating the intellectual habit of seeking out the smart person you disagree with. And people who are truly educated should think of this as a duty, and too many, that's too hard, frankly. I think we've got a very comfortable, very affluent, a very expensive academy right now that's a little uncomfortable with what's going to happen if people actually start talking to each other. They might get upset, and they've kind of forgotten that that's part of the point. That the emotional rigor of actually expanding your mind or taking on arguments that may be wrong or taking on arguments that may change your mind is something that our great academy is shying away from.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Greg Lukianoff, thank you very much for talking with Reason TV. The book is Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship and the End of American Debate. The organization is FIRE, Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, which is online at thefire.org. And Greg, you also blog at the Huffington Post, correct?
Yes, I do.
So, for Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.